Hello everyone. We're going to do a little bit of good news today and talk about Roosevelt's New Deal. Herbert Hoover had been the president for 4 years during the worst depression the world had ever seen. It can be argued that we've had worse since, but at that time there were no safety nets in place, so people felt it a lot more than they have the current recessions. So when Roosevelt came into office, there were a lot of questions he faced, as you can see by this political cartoon. Um, the war debts with Germany and how much France and England owed us, what to do about taxation, farm relief, unemployment, the World Court, our prohibition, which in his first 100 days, he actively worked to get rid of. His campaign promise was to have beer and wine flowing within his first 100 days. And that stimulated the economy. People were drinking again and paying taxes on that drink. And of course, tariffed the economy, so he went into the White House with a lot of questions. So, while we're doing this lecture, I want you to think about what's currently going on. Think about the stimulus plan our government just put into place and what that is proposing to do. We didn't have that event like Black Friday, and hopefully we're not having that same crash that happened that led us into the Great Depression, but we've learned from that. We learned that in desperate times, desperate measures have to be taken. For Herbert Hoover, when he was president during that crisis, he had done more than any other president had up until that point with the federal government in trying to fix it. But the problem was so big, it was him with a little tiny kiddie pail trying to save himself from a tsunami. So think about that when you're thinking about what's going on now and the New Deal. Okay, so first thing Roosevelt did when he got into office is declare a bank holiday. Okay, banks are going bankrupt right and left, so we're just going to close all the banks. And then they have to prove that they're solvent, that they're able to be secure. So this temporary bank holiday gave us time to recover, where people weren't just withdrawing their money, hiding it in their mattresses. And there was an emergency banking act declared. And the most important, okay, maybe not the most important thing, but one of the very most important things to come out of this is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. This affects you in your everyday life. This is the FDIC. It guarantees your savings in your checking or savings account. It guarantees it up to a certain amount, because before, when banks closed, your money would go away. This FDIC insurance means that the money would still be protected, so we didn't have to worry about runs on banks anymore. And the Security and Exchange Commission kept banks from speculating wildly with your money, because before there wasn't this kind of regulation on banking. So, one of my political cartoons here, Roosevelt driving the ship of state into sunnier, happier times. We are coming through a storm. There's detractors that are ridiculing him, but he knows the true course and he's going to get us out of this. Okay, another political cartoon, of course. Roosevelt, see him? He's a little pugilist there in the ring. He is fighting the problem of the economy, of prohibition, of banking problems. Farm Relief Act, not so much. This is a big problem. Remember, farmers were operating at a loss. Everybody was planting wheat in the same crops. They were competing in a world market. And the farms just weren't profitable. Should we pay agricultural parity? Should we give farmers money to keep them afloat when they can't hit the market value that matches what they put into it? So he worked on agricultural parity. Remember, they worked on it before him, but we never came to anything. Coolidge couldn't figure it out. Roosevelt tackled it during the Great Depression, but it was a difficult problem. Okay, so see this sign in the window? The NRA does not stand for the National Rifle Association in this. It's the National Recovery Act. And I will put a link below to Jimmy Durante giving a very interesting rendition of what he thinks the NRA is. You should watch it. You ought to get a job. I suggest you watch it. It'll be linked below. Okay. Despite Jimmy Durante's enthusiastic song about this, the Supreme Court wasn't convinced. They decided that there were bits of it that were unconstitutional. And this ticked off Roosevelt pretty darn bad. Okay, there was also the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was a huge government project to bring power to this rural valley that had electric power in a lot of places. Here's a map of the work from the power plants from the dams. I'll leave that on for a second so you can see it. There was also the Civilian Conservation Corps. So this is make work. We didn't want to just hand out welfare because, while people enjoy a present, they don't want to just be on welfare. So what was going on is, you're going to come work for the government. And the government gave these young men paychecks with the understanding that they would send the majority of it home to their families. So they got to spend a little bit of it in the local towns, but the most of it went to give their families money. There was also mortgage relief. Does this sound even remotely familiar to you guys with this mortgage relief that we're debating now? And so there was a lot of make-work programs. Here's a couple of camps or parks that were built under this make-work. Here in Bronson, Florida, we had, and all around the country, these parks were put into place. Of course, not everyone was happy. There was a whisper campaign. Roosevelt's on drugs. Roosevelt's gone mad. There were people who thought, if you look at this political cartoon, Roosevelt's leading the country astray. Instead of following the right path of Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, he's leading us down this easy, radical shortcut that's dangerous, and it'll drag us down into this muck of Bolshevism, of the path of communism that Russia followed. Yep, that's exactly where we are now. No, his New Deal plans, most of them were really good. Okay, but he did have critics. Huey Long thought he was not going far enough. Huey Long was, I think he was governor of Louisiana. He was called the Kingfish. I don't know how he got that nickname, but he was like, he had this really, really wild idea that elementary school kids, school children, should be issued books instead of having to pay for them themselves. Yep, that's dangerous radicalism right there. Father Charles Conklin thought Roosevelt wasn't going far enough in some areas, and he was calling for more. Of course, he was a painful anti-Semite, so I'm glad he didn't have more power than he did. And of course, the Townsend plan was retirees should get this set amount of pension. This Townsend plan was picking up steam. People thought this was a really good idea. So Roosevelt grabbed it and said, yeah, maybe we should do something with this. And from this, we got the Social Security Act that we still benefit from now. Unionism was picking up steam here, and Roosevelt While he didn't say that the bosses had to exactly follow the unions, he put in place that the unions had to be at least talked to, which was a major move because unions hadn't actually had any political support before this. And around this time, the AFL-CIO, the two biggest unions, merged. Okay, and the unions at this time discovered this really wild thing that helped them achieve a lot of power, and that was called the sit-down strike. Because before, the union members would go out with their picket signs and say, yep, the company is treating us bad, we need to do better. And so the companies would get scab labor, bring them in, they did the job. With a sit-down strike, they were blocking people from actually going in and using the facilities, and they found out that this was a really powerful tool. If nobody could get in and build the stuff, the companies did have to just close down, and they got a lot of momentum. Of course, in 1937, there was a Memorial Day massacre, so there was a strike. The labor struggles were problematic in Chicago, and striking workers attempted to march on Republic Steel, and they were attacked by the Chicago police. There was clubs, tear gas. They turned away the marchers, and strikers were killed during this activity. I will link a YouTube video below. It's got pretty bad sound, but they're discussing the massacre, and there's actually footage of the event. Okay, so I mentioned the Social Security Act. This image here is Ida Mae Fuller. She was the first person to get check number 1, and it was for, let me see, $22.54 in 1940. Social Security has increased since then. Okay, this is my favorite thing to come out of the New Deal. This is the Federal Arts Project. So, okay, there were a lot of laborers out of work, factory workers, a lot of the car plants had closed, steel mill workers, all that had closed down. And they were giving relief, let's help out these laborers. But wait a minute, musicians, artists, photographers were all out of work too. So what was really cool is they paid writers to go around and write handbooks on like different states and like all the cool things to go see. They paid sculptors to do beautiful work. They paid artists and sculptors and everybody. And if you look in the corner, that's the logo of the Federal Arts Project. Isn't it great? Okay. They also paid archaeologists. There are boxes and boxes and boxes, actually, of excavated material from the 1930s Make-Works projects. So while they did a lot of really cool archaeology and we learned a lot, it's not exactly all at the same scientific caliber that we do it now, but we got a lot out of it, and archaeology actually had a moment where it was shining very bright because a lot of people were doing this work. I just wish they had been more scientific about it. Okay. In 1936, a man named Alf Landon, poor man, ran against our president. Here's his campaign slogan: "That leadership along the trail, which we have loved long since and have lost a while, has come to us again. Yay!" Well, maybe it hasn't come to us again, because poor little guy, he didn't have very many electoral votes. So it showed how popular Roosevelt was for his second run. Of course, people are saying he's setting himself up as a dictator. He was reorganizing the government. And he did something really, really bad here. He decided he was going to pack the Supreme Court. And I'm not going to be able to play this for you. I will link below where he has a Fireside chat where he talks about the reason he wants to change the Supreme Court. Oh, look at those poor Supreme Court justices. They're over 70 and they're tired and they can't do their jobs right because they just have such a workload. for every justice over 70, I think it was, I'm going to put in one younger so that we'll have a lot more people to do this work. What he was trying to do, he was still ticked off about them overturning his National Recovery Act legislation. So he put into place where he was trying to do this, but even Congress is like, yeah, no, that's just a really bad idea. We're not doing that. And I'm going to put in the link below to his Fireside chat. If you look at this, he describes the United States as a three-horse team. And he's like, I've been criticized as trying to drive this team. But if you look here, one horse is Congress, I'm the other horse, and the third horse that's pulling the wrong way is the Supreme Court. And I am just one of the horses, and the American people are actually the driver of this team, and the American people want the Supreme Court to do what they're told. So, okay, that sums up the Fireside chat, so you don't have to listen to it now. Luckily, his Supreme Court deal fell through, and that was only the second worst thing he did. The very first worst thing he did was the Japanese internment camps in World War II, but that's next week's lecture. Okay, back to what he did right. While he didn't have any African Americans in his actual official cabinet, he discussed issues of the African American experience with the greatest African American leaders of the time. He formed a black cabinet. He tried to at least find out how to bring some kind of form of justice to African Americans, because they were suffering more from the Great Depression than any other group. While unemployment was floating around 20% for most of America in general, a lot of the African American communities were hit with 50% unemployment. So by at least discussing it with black leaders, he was trying. Another good thing he did here is he replaced the Dawes Act, this awful ethnocidal plan to take away community ownership of land and put it into individuals' hands, managed by really terrible government officials. They tried to do the Indian Reorganization Act, which helps alleviate some of the problems under the Dawes Act. Another amazingly important thing he did here is the first woman in the president's cabinet. Frances Perkins was made, Secretary of Labor. She had a very left agenda. Here's one of her quotes. "The people are what matter to government, and a government should aim to give all the people under its jurisdiction the best possible life." You could definitely argue that is not the government's job. But at a time when so many people were unemployed and the government needed more responsibility, Frances Perkins' idea as the Secretary of Labor was really important. And of course, we have Eleanor Roosevelt. She was the president's wife, and she was one of his right-hand people. She flew around the country because he had limited mobility. She was his feet on the ground. She went around, she discussed what was going on with the labor officials. She talked to the union. She talked to people around the country to help alleviate the problem. So while she wasn't the first woman president, she sure as heck had a lot of say in the way the country was run. And that's it for my presentation. I hope you think about what was going on then and how it parallels now. We are not in a Great Depression like they were then, but we've learned from this. We learned from what the New Deal did. We learned from what the New Deal did not. And we're trying to actively preempt the next depression by doing this stimulus package. So think about that when you listen to this, when you listen to the news. Think about what we learned from the New Deal. Thank you. Everybody stay safe and take care of yourselves.